Good afternoon. Welcome to the Portland Art Museum, and thank you for coming today on such a beautiful fall afternoon in Portland. I'm delighted to see a packed house and so many familiar faces. This team, so much work goes into realizing a project like this, and so it's very gratifying to see people come to the openings and come to the presentations and participate through the run of the exhibition. It means a lot to us. I'm crazy about opening weekends, about the dinners and the events and the lectures, but it's not my favorite time. My favorite time is just a couple of minutes before the press preview. Usually it's Thursday morning, and we dim the lights in the gallery, and we pull back the carts and the ladders and the mops and the brooms, and we get to see for the first time these paintings hung beautifully against these marvelous colors around terrific architecture. And Janie and Mary, these paintings are incredible. They're mesmerizing to me. They look great at first glance and on slow consideration. The contemporary calligraphy looks wonderful from 30 feet away, but also from 4 inches away. And I know this because it's my nose prints on the glass. When you go through the galleries, I kept going up and touching the glass accidentally. Those historic paintings, the 12 months, you really have to get close and study them so closely. It's terribly generous of you to share those works with the Portland Art Museum and our audiences. We're very grateful for that. We're also grateful But we're also grateful for your support. You supported the research, the travel, the scholarship, the photography, the writing. You've done so much to really elevate this project. You've underwritten the Coles Fellowship for the Study of Asian Art, and Sangha Kim was instrumental to making this project what it is. There's other lead sponsors without whom we could not have done this project. The Japan Foundation underwrote our assistant curator for Japanese art, Jeannie Kenmotsu, who is a real pro. She's smart and hardworking, and she made this exhibition great. The Japan Foundation underwrote the pavilion, the construction of the pavilion and the bespoke furniture that you see in the galleries, which will have a life after this exhibition. So we're also grateful for their support. The Asian Art Council at the museum has been steadfast in supporting all of our projects. And I'd like to call out in particular Alicia Fecker. Thank you for your leadership and guidance and support of this project. Also, a real star of the Asian Art Council was the late Buzzy Salmons. And as you entered the Whitsell Auditorium, you would have passed through the Salmons Gallery, and you might have seen her photograph on the wall. I think Buzzy's daughters, Leslie and Susie and Catherine, are here today. Is that right? Well, welcome and thank you. Other supporters of this project included the Spencer Foundation and Ameriprise Financial and Columbia Threadneedle. The Carpenter Foundation, they're based in Virginia. They fund Asian projects all across North America and Canada and the United States. And that they should support this speaks to the importance of the collection and the scholarship. Christie's hosted a wonderful opening dinner on Thursday night. We're grateful for their support. And it's been nice to see, they've flown in experts on this material, and I've seen them in the galleries, not just on Thursday and Friday, but also Saturday. And we're grateful also for their support. John and Mia Hervin Moore and the Jackson Foundation made key gifts. The Mildred Schnitzer Fund, the Donald Jenkins Visiting Scholar Fund allows us to bring in outside experts to study these materials and support our scholarship. And the Homan Fund also supports this and many other Asian exhibitions at the museum. These projects take years to realize and a whole ton of work. The support from these groups that I've just named, they pay for trucks and carpenters and painters and builders and photographers and research and travel and presentations like today's. And you're in store for a very good talk. I'm delighted to introduce Maribeth Graybill the Arlene and Harold Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art at the museum. Maribeth lived and studied in Japan for many years before teaching Asian art at UC Berkeley and then Swarthmore College. And then she moved into curatorial at the University of Michigan Museum of Art before joining the Portland Art Museum in 2007. I was here in 2007, and I've had the pleasure of working with Maribeth on a number of exhibitions, and you've seen them. Everything from samurai armor to Japanese prints, from snuff bottles to children's kimonos. You've seen these projects, and so you know she is a great curator, and she really knows how to make an exhibition. I've traveled with Maribeth. I've been into private collections, I've been into museum storage areas, and I've been to auction houses, and I know that she has a real eye and deep, deep scholarship, the kind that only comes with time. Seen 10,000 works of art, the kind of connoisseurship that comes with passion and commitment. She works so hard. Our offices are side by side. There's 6 inches of sheetrock and paint separating us. And she works the craziest hours. She's there past midnight. Her desk is covered with books and literature, her floor and her chair and her shelves. She's hardworking, she's smart, she has a great eye, and an uproarious laugh. There's times when I'll be quietly working in my office and then I'll hear this burst of laughter coming from Maribeth's. I feel very lucky to count her as a colleague and also as a friend. She's a terrific speaker, so I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Maribeth Graybill, the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Curator of Asian Art. Thanks.
What he really meant to say is you can only do this after you reach a certain age. Thank you all so much for coming out this afternoon when you really should be at Multnomah Falls. By mid-October, we should, if all things were normal, be in the midst of our autumn deluge. So we are happy to have such good weather to bless the occasion. So my topic today is finding the poetic in Japanese visual art. But I too must begin by expressing thanks, and I'm going to many, many people that made the exhibition possible. My list, of course, begins with Marion Cheney Coles, who for the past decade welcomed me and other members of the curatorial team into their home. They spent countless hours bringing out paintings and calligraphies for us to examine, and sandwiches and pomegranate juice to sustain us in our efforts. And as Dawn mentioned, they've been generous supporters of the museum in many ways. So Marion Cheney, may I ask you to stand and be recognized, please, right here. Amongst the ways they have made the Portland Art Museum a better place is by enriching our holdings in Japanese art. And we have put a small selection of these on display in a gallery adjacent to the ink painting section of the exhibition. So I hope you have a chance to see that as well. But for the next 3 months, all of us, all who visit the museum, can share in the greatest gift to date, which is the loan of these incomparable riches from their collection. I also want to take this occasion to express my thanks to our director, Brian Fariso, for his unflagging support for a long-term project that often took me away from my everyday duties. He's one of the very few museum directors who believes that research is central to the curatorial enterprise. Likewise, Donald Urquhart, whom you've just met, propped me up every time I faltered with encouragement and wise solutions to what seemed intractable problems. The scope of this exhibition, spanning 12 centuries of painting and calligraphy, is far beyond my own expertise. Through Cheney Cole's collections and my own, we were able to assemble an international team of scholars who collaborated with us over the past 2 or perhaps more years. Each person was involved in selecting works for the exhibition and researching and writing about them for the forthcoming publication. Because I am very slow at editing, the catalog is delayed. It will come out in early 2019, and you can sign up for it in our museum shop, and I encourage you to, because it will be fully illustrated and present new research on all of these materials. But in the order you see listed, Sarako Oki, curator of Japanese art at Yale University Art Gallery, wrote about the calligraphy. Arata Shimao of Gakushuin University in Tokyo, the ink painting. Paul Berry, formerly at the University of Washington and Kansai Gaida Universities, now retired, Literati Painting. And Michio Morioka, an independent scholar in Seattle, 20th century painting. We also had advice from Masaki Arakawa of Gakushuin University for the ceramics. The gallery labels are deeply indebted to the work that they wrote for the catalog. My own contribution is writing about poet portraits. Many others, far too numerous to list here, assisted. We had people helping us decipher texts and read seals and translating. It's a very, very long list. You'll have to buy the catalog to get all their names. Here in the museum, my colleagues Ginny Kenmotsu and Sanga Kim, Ginny, the Japan Foundation Assistant Curator for Japanese Art, and Sanga, our Coles Curatorial Fellow, have been essential partners. We have lived and breathed this exhibition together for the past year. I'm deeply indebted to them. And in truth, every department in the museum played a key role. The registrars, the preps, education, development, security, just every person in the museum has been engaged, and that's always the case with a main stage show like this, and I'm really honored to have them as my colleagues. And last, I want to shout out thanks to Tom Ross, the brilliant carpenter and designer who took my vague list of desiderata and fashioned from that the pavilion that you see in the sculpture court and new benches and tables which will become part of the permanent furniture for the Asian galleries. Amongst many ways that we could have organized an exhibition from the Coles collection, we chose poetic imagination as a theme. A few years ago when this exhibition was a gleam in my eye, I was talking about it to a member of the Asian Art Council, someone who's a collector, and he said, whatever you do, don't put poetry in the title. But I feel that it illuminates an interesting and important narrative in Japanese art over the centuries. I felt that it was a very strong current in the collection, and I myself am biased, having done my dissertation on poet portraits 100 years ago. What makes a painting poetic? Well, let's think first about what is poetry in literature. Ezra Pound defined great literature as simply language charged to the utmost possible degree, and poetry, the most concentrated form of verbal expression. When I read that, I thought, that's it. That's what these paintings are visually, the most concentrated form of verbal expression. Let's turn to the question of poetry in Japanese. Waka means Japanese poetry. It's also called uta, which really means song, or tanka, short poem. I'm going to read the one that inspired this painting. Honobono to akashi no ura no asagiri ni shima gakure yuku fune o shizo omou. Faintly, faintly, through the morning mist in the Bay of Akashi, my thoughts follow the boat that becomes island hidden. Let's think about the language here. Honobono to. Japanese has these wonderful words that it's not quite onomatopoeia because rain might sort of fall, ja, ja, or words like that. So this isn't the sound, but by repeating it, you get this idea of just faintly, honobono to, faintly, faintly. Akashi is a place name. It's a bay to the west of modern-day Osaka. But notice that the time of day and the atmosphere is established by morning mist, this time of day when we can only see things, only perceive things dimly. And then we have the boat, the one concrete thing. It's ostensibly the focus of the poet's thoughts, but this is not a poem about a boat. We understand, in part because we know the conventions of Japanese poetry, that this is a lament of parting from his wife or a loved one. It is she who is sailing out of reach, hidden beyond the islands. Since the early 10th century, this verse has been attributed to Kakinomoto no Hitomaro, who was revered ever since as the saint of poetry. So this serves, this poem, I think, serves well as a way for us to think about some of the key characteristics of waka poetry. And these include, it is brief, 31 syllables. It is elegant. The language is usually decorous, and it is indirect. A great deal is left unsaid. Here's a detail from that painting, and I wanted to show you, you have to stand in front of this painting and focus on it for quite some time before you can see, and I hope you can see it here. I don't have a pointer. Can you see the boats disappearing in the mist? Okay, all right. So you may be thinking, well, I can imagine that is true of a lot of Japanese painting. What in Japanese painting is not poetic? Here's an example. This is a massive mural that covers a wall about 28, 30 feet long with a single massive pine tree and an eagle. This is on the walls of the reception room at Nijo Castle in Kyoto. And the message here is very direct. I have power and you don't. So this is the owner of this space, who intends to intimidate all of you, is the Tokugawa shogun, the embodiment of the eternal, represented by the pine tree, and military might by the eagle. So there are no ambiguities here, there are no literary references, and the meaning can be read from 50 feet away. But this same artist did this work in the exhibition. And I'm just showing you a detail here. He was a master of the most evanescent ink painting, where much of the composition is left bare, unpainted paper or unpainted silk. But if you look at it closely, you realize that is not empty space. It's light, it's mist. This is a kind of impressionist painting done in ink centuries before those barbarians in France thought of it. So this landscape, like Hitomaro's poem, is an evocation of atmospheric effects. It's a world in which nature responds to, echoes, surrounds, supports our emotional states. Just sort of keep that idea in mind. Now, how does poetry take visual form in Japanese art? The most straightforward examples, perhaps, are the poetry texts, of which we have several, written out in elegant calligraphy. This work, which is very near the beginning of the exhibition, is a fragment of the earliest extant text of the Kokin Wakashu. Compiled in 905, it was the first of 21 imperial anthologies of waka poetry. That fact alone should tell you how important waka poetry is in Japanese culture. It's a small work. It's actually a page from a book, not a hand scroll, but a codex, a book, and the calligraphy is written on paper with tiny flecks of gold. So writing poetry on beautiful paper is an act that's quite similar to copying out sacred Buddhist texts, Buddhist sutras, on beautifully decorated paper. The term in Japanese is shogun, majesty. But by doing this, in the case of the Buddhist text, you earn Buddhist merit by expressing reverence for the text. I think that the people who did this kind of writing, who are often in the early, from the 9th to 12th century and for some time after, members of the aristocracy themselves, they too are gaining poetic merit by this act of reverence towards the text. Beautiful texts were also used as gift on special occasions. There's a very famous manuscript in the early 12th century that was done for the wedding of the crown prince. Another possibility is to illustrate the poem. We can say that the Kimura Muzan painting of Hitomaro standing on the shore was one of those. And this is a fragment of a fun painting. It's perhaps the best humor in the exhibition, and I had to have it for that reason. This is by Kano Naganobu. And in the pair, he illustrates poems by well-known Chinese authors of the 8th century. And this one is Li Bai's Accompanying My Uncle, the vice director, on an excursion to Lake Dongting. 3 poems written on becoming intoxicated. And there you see them gathered around a picnic table getting rip-roaring drunk. The third section of the exhibition focuses on what is known as Literati Painting. This is a type of painting that originated in China and was eagerly sought after. It's not sort of an export, but it's more something eagerly imported by intellectuals, largely males, but there's an important exception, who had been well trained in the Confucian classics. And they found, and this is one of the wonderful conundrums of Edo period Japanese society, the way that these people found in Chinese culture and language and painting styles a marvelous sense of personal identity and group collegiality. This is a work by an important, very early work by one of the first generation masters, Ike Taiga. It's surrounded by calligraphy done by another artist, Tessai, but we're here just looking at the painting itself. And in a hand scroll painting, because a hand scroll would be unrolled from right to left, you enter at the right. So we enter at the right and we walk along this little escarpment, we cross a bridge, and it's a little bit hard to see it, it's a little fuzzy, but there's a servant waiting for us at that gate. And then we continue through and we come to a person in the cottage. And then at the very end, Taiga copied out a poem. So the final lines of the poem is a poem by a Chinese poet, Wang Quan, and at the very end, the last lines read, "A cool breeze fills my robe and sleeves. I stand up and play upon my chin. Its tones are harmonious, expansive. Their lingering resonance echoes all day long." So this is an example of Japanese artists in the literati movement, again, 18th and 19th century, becoming extremely familiar with seeking out Chinese poetry, and it may be that a very specific poem inspires their pictorial response. They also, on occasion, wrote the Chinese poems themselves. One more example of a Chinese poem is this work, which is a personal favorite of mine. This is a very charming landscape by Tanomura Chikuden, and he added an inscription at the upper right. The first line of the inscription he wrote in an archaic Chinese script, a script that goes back to about 3rd, 4th century BC. But the poem is again an 8th century poet. It's the same poet, Li Bai. It's just 2 lines of the verse, but it says, "You ask me for what reason I reside in azure mountains. I smile and do not answer, my heart entirely at peace." And in the rest of the inscription, the other 2 lines, he says, "Master Ryo asked me for this painting 3 years ago, and I kind of took a while to get it to him, and I'm sorry." But in any case, if we look at this work, we can imagine that the figures, what I love about Chikuden's painting is the tiny, charming figures in them that sort of invite us to identify with them. And so often in Chinese and Japanese paintings, you have an image of a solitary poet gazing at a waterfall. That's a traditional theme in Chinese painting. And we like to gaze at waterfalls because the negative ions give us a buzz. But what Chikuden does is he makes it 2 people. I think his paintings are always about friendship. And so here we have these two people engaged in animated conversation, and I'm certain that as soon as they sit down, they'll write verses about their experience. Another way, and a way that I think is really quite unique to Japan, I can't think of any other culture that does this in this way, is imaginary portraits of the great poets of the past. And this is often done in the guise of illustrating some very famous poetry anthologies. But this is a early 17th century portrait imagining, but based on earlier paintings, but still imaginary, a great poet of the 9th century. He became a monk and then an abbot, but the poem is one from his youth, in which he essentially says that the path to my door is overgrown with weeds. And he's not complaining that the lawn service is late. What he means is that his lover doesn't come anymore. So again, indirect, elegant language that expects the audience to sort of be familiar with the conventions. But what the language does is it creates, the language and the painting, it creates communities of shared heritage and shared values. Perhaps the most common approach, the most common way that poetry finds visual form, is when the artist draws on not a single verse, but a reservoir of poetic tradition in which certain images appeared in countless poems with a particular kind of meaning associated. So this is a wonderful work done in the 1930s, and this is one of many artists that I did not know before visiting the Coles collection. Anyway, it's one of two in the exhibition to portray deer in an autumn setting. And in Japanese waka poetry, deer only show up in the autumn. Now, we know that they're out there in other seasons, but in poetry, they only show up in autumn. And what they do in the autumn is that they cry, and that cry is always a plaint for the loss of the mate. So I'm going to read you one poem written by a person who died in the year 1000. The deer on Pine Mountain, where there are no falling leaves, knows the coming of autumn only by the sound of his own voice. But we know that the sound of his voice is a lament. So when this painter is doing this in 1930s, and when Matsumura Goshun did a similar subject in the 1780s, both of them know that the audience that looking at the painting has already, in grade school, memorized 40 poems about deer in autumn, and that you bring that knowledge to the way that you respond to the image. Here's another modern example. I think it hangs right next to the last one. Shimomura Kanzan, Herons Under the Moon. Herons and egrets, and I confess I'm never really sure of the difference. So if they're ornithologists after there, see me afterwards. But are in Chinese poetry, have been since at least the 11th century, emblems of purity, because they wander around in the muck and they don't get dirty. But I actually suspect that by the time we get to this painting, that's not so much of a concern. With this work, what I want to do is shift gears to think about lyricism, or the poetic, in the style of the painting itself. So this is a work, it's a moonlit landscape. Part of what's being poetic is you don't do it at noon. We have mists rising. So as in that first poem by Hitomaro, it's a time of day when our vision is partially obscured. And then we have these two egrets huddled on the railing of a bridge. In this painting, as in a waka poem, much is left unsaid, undefined. This is a much earlier example. This is an ink painting from the 16th century. I think that the ink paintings in this exhibition in particular have this character, and they're all designed for sustained and engaged looking. In this particular case, the paper, because it is 6th century, has darkened with age. that might be a little bit closer to what it looked like originally. But even then, even when we use the magic of modern technology to euthanize, to remove the ears, if we look at this painting, what's painted still remains elusive. It's still beyond our grasp. And that's in the quality of the brushwork itself, the use of wash, and the use of incredible range of very subtle tones. I think it's also because the style itself is what old-fashioned art historians would have called optic rather than haptic. This is not something you can reach out and touch. The bodies of the egrets are not painted, but it's unpainted paper, so their whole shape is defined by the surrounding washes and then little touches of black for the beaks and their legs. So this is a style that, again, leaves much unsaid. It's partially there. It's coy. It's a little bit beyond our grasp, but it invites us with our minds to fill in what is left unsaid. I think that this is something endemic, really, to monochrome ink painting. By its very nature, it's incomplete. The color, if you will, is the part that's left unsaid. And like the act of poetry, these images invite, one could say demand, our engagement to complete the picture. They ask that you become part of a dialogue with them, and you imagine, you fill in what has been left unspoken. The special dialogue between painting, or especially ink paintings, and poetry becomes ritualized, we could say, in Zen monasteries in medieval Japan in something called poem painting scrolls. This work is not in the exhibition, but it is in the Coles collection. And this is an example. You can see it's a tall vertical work. And several monks, I think it's 7 here, inscribed their poetic response to a painting. They inscribe it directly on an adjacent piece of paper. This scroll is dated to the this scroll, which is in the exhibition, dated to the mid-15th century, I think was intended for similar treatment. Although painted in Japan, probably by a Japanese monk, the landscape here is an imaginary view of southern China, lush with verdant bamboo. The time of day is evening, as the mists rise from the lake to obscure the distant hills. A man, seated on a chair inside the pavilion, is gazing out across the water. And as Shimao Arata points out in his essay in the catalog, what he's doing is he's getting ready to write a poem. That's what you do when you look at landscape, you write poems. He also points out, Shimao-san also points out, that Japanese landscape paintings often have 2 points of view. There's our viewpoint. We stand outside and look at this sliver of landscape as through a tall and narrow window. But there's also the viewpoint or gaze of the person inside the painting. We hope that this exhibition will encourage you to put yourselves in the picture and perhaps compose a verse or two about the emotions that the paintings evoke. And that's it. Thank you. I thought that would take a lot longer than it did. So we have time for questions, if there are any questions from the audience.
We have mics on both sides.
I left a lot unsaid. Waka poetry is the older form, and that is 31 syllables, 5-7-5-7-7. Even if you look at the very earliest imperial anthology, the Kokin Wakashu, when they edited that, very often the poems, you'll have a series of poems that construct a mini narrative. That's most apparent in love affairs, where you'll have, sort of poems exchanged back and forth. There will often be headnotes that say the circumstances under which it happened. That idea of, and very often, well, in the Tale of Genji, for example, you're reading along in a prose passage, and then the author resorts to a waka poem when she hits a moment of particular emotional intensity. So what I'm saying is that waka are very often embedded in a larger kind of narrative context. And a form of poetry that becomes important, especially in the medieval period, sort of time when Zen takes the main stage, but there are some major poets, is renga, when you have poets, that narrative becomes something that people compose as a group. So one person does the 5-7-5, the next person does 7-7, the next person does 5-7-5, and that goes on. That was really, I think, one of the most creative form of Japanese poetry in, let's say, 15th century. And then you have Matsuo Basho, who becomes a master of simply the 17 syllables, the first half, if you will, or the 5-7-5 of a waka. And in his time, and really quite until also in the 18th century, that was called haikai, not haiku, but haikai. And both Matsuo Basho and then Buson, who's a painter in the exhibition about a century later, were concerned with making that a serious and profound form of art. I actually don't know when it started to be called haiku, but I think that is in more modern times, possibly with Masao Gashiki in the 20th century. Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about the technique on how they use wash and dry brush and wet brush and gold? Can you talk a little bit about how they do that?
Very well.
Yes, exactly.
Gosh. It depends on the painter and on the painting, but one of the things that's important about these, that's true of all of these works, they're on paper or silk, and the paper or silk has been sized to some degree. Otherwise, it would just, through capillary action, the ink would spread into unrecognizable blots. So it's sized. In the literati paintings, the paintings where we have color, very often what you'll see is the artist lays down the light washes. In Chikuden's case, it's this soft, rosy tan color for much of the land masses. And then they'll come back many, many times, sort of take time to build up the painting, and with brushes where the greater or lesser amount of pigment or ink is loaded on the brush. And oops, again, I wish I had a pointer, but as you see, if you look at the tree branches over there, he's dragging it along to create the outlines of the tree branch. And there are times when his brush gets a little dry, and when the brush gets dry, it breaks up and you can see some of the paper underneath it. You sort of sense it kind of scratching on the surface. And in other places, like in the contours for the rocks at the right, the brush is very wet. So each artist will have kind of a different way to do this. They'll also have characteristic gestures of the hand. So one of the things about Chikuden, he's wonderful at these little dots. Often his landscape is just filled with, they're called texture dots in Chinese and Japanese painting, but they just kind of are sprinkled all over the painting anyway. They just kind of animate the surface. If you look at Ike Taiga or his wife Tokuyama Gyokuran, he often, particularly if you look at their foliage, they each have characteristic toolkit of kinds of brushwork that they use for foliage. So one kind of brushwork looks like a little bunch of bananas, and one kind looks like a bunch of grapes, and one kind looks like a bunch of twigs. And what's really fun is to sort of see what they do with that kind of patterning, and then how their disciples, Aoki Shukuya is one, Aoki Mokabe is another, how they personally interpret that patterning. I don't have a detail here of Yosa Busson, but he's the first painting you encounter in the Literati section. And I once spent sort of 2 years intensively studying him and looking at his paintings. And what I think is extraordinary about Busson, if you look at his grasses or if you look at his foliage, you look hard to find any two brushstrokes that are parallel. There are some artists who, this is how they move their arm, and so you get that stroke repeated and repeated and repeated. We don't get that kind of patterning in Busson. There are some paintings out there that have a Busson name on them where you see that, and I think those are fakes. He never, I think, phoned it in. And my sense, I think I say this in the label, is that Busson's paintings create, not all of them, he has some early works and he has some works that are a little bit more tidy, but in his late great paintings, of which the work in the exhibition is one, the brushwork creates this really dense web, and in my mind it pulls you in and it holds you there forever. Okay.
I wanted to ask, you said earlier about the symbolism of the deer in autumn. Are there any other commonly used symbols in Japanese poetry and Japanese art?
Yes.
Could you tell us a few?
I mean, hundreds. Scotch would help. Okay, many of the symbols of nature, which was the subject of a lot of poetry at the court, and it's also, interestingly, taken up and very strongly celebrated by the 20th century painters in the exhibition, are about the passage of time. And in the Heian period, because culture is strongly inflected by Buddhism as well, the passage of time is associated with a sense of, it's called mono no aware, we could say the sadness of things. The point is, if you're going to have a Japanese poem about cherry blossoms, you never enjoy cherry blossoms without an awareness that you're not going to enjoy them for long. There are seasonal rituals that were part of the imperial court. One of these was that on New Year's Day, you would go out and you would pluck little tiny pine seedlings, because pines will eventually grow to great height and become a symbol of eternity, but plucking them on New Year's Day was a way to celebrate the new year. Many people have argued that the obsession of the imperial court in the Heian period with the seasons and the importance of seasonal rituals is based in the idea, which comes really from China, that the ideal emperor, when the ideal emperor is on the throne, the world is in harmony, and it's the emperor's responsibility to see to it that everything happens at the right time and in the right place. Particularly, this is a kind of philosophy that you would get in an agrarian society, and Japanese wealth for most of history was based in agriculture. So just about every peonies, this is the Chinese, but it comes in Japan, peonies, because of their beauty, are associated with abundance and sexy female beauty. I mean, the list, it would be a book more than 1,500 pages, so I can only give you a taste.
My question's about color. And as the powerful white eagle in the gnarled pine, ancient, the color felt very bright and fresh. And I was wondering if it's been freshened up or why I saw it that way.
In traditional Japanese, as in traditional Chinese painting, there are two families, we might say, of colors. And one of them is mineral pigments, And these actually use ground up minerals. So the brown is ground up ochre, blue is ground up azurite, green is ground up malachite. These colors are dense, opaque colors, and we find them often in the kind of large-scale paintings that decorated the kind of a public space, a reception room in an interior, especially for the military aristocracy, but for other people as well. A good example of mineral pigments on a painting is the screen that's in the petty corridor of Sugawara Michizane going into exile. That painting is done in mineral pigments and actual gold, the use of gold on paper, on sized paper. Most of the paintings in the exhibition, this one, most of the Literati paintings, use primarily vegetable pigments. And vegetable pigments are never going to have that kind of opacity. In a few of the paintings, though, you will see, for example, I think Soshiseki in his wonderful pair of birds, and some of the paintings where you'll see a really, really intense green for the foliage. Some of the people, of the artists, do use malachite and azurite, and that will be a brighter, more intense color. It's a question of choice of pigments. Historically, the idea is that mineral pigments are much harder to control and much harder to use. So there was a tendency that would be used by artists who had been trained in that as a profession from childhood. So Kano Tanyu, who did that large painting. The works by Kano Naganobu that show the poets getting drunk, that's Kano school professional painters, that uses mineral pigments. Many of the literati painters were sort of self-trained or trained by others ahead of them in the field, but their choice also because it's associated with the Chinese tradition of literati painting, which purports to be an amateur school of painting. You don't want to be too professional. They would, by choice, tend to use not only vegetable pigments, but a limited palette of pigments.
I have a question about the Japanese artists who depict and reflect the Chinese symbolism and the Chinese style. Did they actually visit China, or did they get that from references or paintings that came to Japan from China?
For the vast majority of people, it was Chinese texts, Chinese paintings, and occasionally Chinese people who brought that information, those sources to Japan. One of the interesting things about the Japanese-Chinese relationship over the centuries is I can't think of a single example where we have China actively exerting influence on Japan. They didn't care. What you have is people on the archipelago of Japan actively, eagerly seeking out more advanced technologies from the continent. There's one time when we think that there was probably significant in-migration, and that's 3rd century BC to 3rd century AD, when you get wet rice agriculture, the use of iron, and the wheel, potter's wheel, coming in. But we think there's actual migrations of people coming to Japan, probably migrating down through the Korean peninsula. So there are many moments in Japanese history when this adoption from Japan becomes quite intense. And one of them really is the late 6th to the 8th century, when Japan is very eager, and especially the powerful clans in Japan, are very eager to figure out how the Chinese managed to govern an enormous empire. And so they adopt Chinese statecraft. They adopt the idea of an emperor at the center of a series of provinces. And Buddhism sort of is imported with that continental culture at that point. The importance of Zen in medieval Japan is a second time when there's a fascination with, and you have the most powerful members of the elite immersing themselves in Chinese culture. But the Zen monasteries didn't just teach Buddhism. They were universities of Chinese studies. If you were a monk or if you were a lay patron, you would be reading Chinese histories, you would be reading Chinese poetry, and the Ashikaga shoguns are eagerly importing Chinese paintings. And the Chinese paintings, especially the ink paintings from southern Song and Yuan China that they imported, that became the pictorial reservoir that first monks and later professional artists drew on to create the whole ink painting tradition in Japan. And with the literati artists, during the Edo period, from 1615 to 1868, it was the policy of the Tokugawa government that Japan was closed to outside trade. If you went abroad, you could not return on pain of death. The only place that foreigners could come in Japan was Nagasaki, and so you had an island ghetto where the Dutch could be when they traded. The Chinese were allowed ashore. But there was such hunger for Chinese poetry, for for finding out, what's the latest in Chinese calligraphy, the latest in Chinese painting, that if a Chinese person came ashore who was not only a merchant but also a painter, Japanese people would find their way to him and ask him to teach them. All of that changes after Japan that sort of overthrows the Tokugawa military government. The emperor is restored to kind of a constitutional monarchy. And as Japan moves toward becoming a modern, industrialized nation state, it is also looking towards the continent, both with admiration but also with colonial ambitions. But we find a number of Japanese traveling to China. The two, let's see, in the exhibition of works that have been given to the museum, the man who does the sort of vast painting of Chinese peaks, we know that he went to China in 1913. The man, Hashimoto Kansetsu, who has the sort of winter landscape, we know that he traveled in China. So a number, Japanese were able to travel abroad. Gochiku, one of the calligraphers, spent a lot of time in China and was greatly respected there. So after, really about the 1870s, 1880s, Japanese artists could travel abroad, and some of them chose China. And if you read the labels in the modern section, a number of them also chose France, because there was a notion that there was a very strong trend towards Western painting, particularly oil painting, as being what modern painting was, and France had the most appeal. So there are paintings in the exhibition who knew Manet and Degas in person, but what's interesting about the people we chose for the exhibition, there are others who went on to do French-style painting, but of the artists in the exhibition, both the taste of our collectors, but also the point we wanted to make here, for them, time spent in Europe spurred them to rethink, how can I do something that's Japanese? I'm not French, after all. So it's really only in the 20th century examples, or very end of the 19th century, that the artists themselves are traveling to the source. Is there a question?
Was there any kind of guild system as there was in Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries in Holland?
The question is, were painters organized into guilds? No, not quite. But there were hereditary schools of painters. And we have works by those schools in the exhibition. The Tosa School was a hereditary school of painters, and essentially you learned to become a painter by being an apprentice to your father. And the Kano School was like that. So there's sort of a household atelier, and the children, the male boys, learn from a very early age. They start sweeping the floors and all of that. And also you would take in disciples. And like other Japanese hereditary crafts, lacquer work, bamboo making, pick one, if you did not have a male offspring, you might officially adopt your most adept male pupil. So that's in these in certain traditional lineages, the Kano and the Tosa schools. But for many of the artists in the exhibition, the literati artists and the monks, They are not in any kind of a system like that. They sort of learn independently and produce independently. And when we get to the 20th century artists, already in the very early Meiji period in the 1870s and 80s, the government is setting up art schools, and you begin to get universal education. So in the 20th century, if you went to art school, you could become a painter. There was no hereditary or class requirement whatsoever. And I think with that, we should be about done. Thank you very much for coming today.